In 2003, my brother and I were playing a video game, Tony Hawk Underground, on a Monday night in the family game room. On Mondays, Fear Factor aired new episodes, and my parents called us to the living room to watch them with them as we did weekly. We paused our game, left it on for an hour while we watched Fear Factor, and once we came back to it, there was a new file named Dan. When we tried to open it, we couldn't. It was corrupted. We also couldn't delete it. We know that no one in our family of 4 made the file, as we were all together for the hour that the PS2 was unattended watching Fear Factor. There was an auto accident down the street a week before, and I found out a few weeks later that a teenager named Dan was killed in the accident. Our street was off of a busy road, and it happened basically at the intersection of our street and the busy road. Weird things continued happening, like the family TV turning on by itself, or changing the channels to Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network on its own. It made my parents, who were always skeptics, believe in ghosts. I grew up in southwest Saskatchewan and moved onto my aunt's farm in 2019 to live in the other house that's on their property. The house is fairly odd, but I loved it. It wasn't long after I moved in, though, that I started to feel uneasy in the house alone. I would close every window when it got dark, as it felt like something was watching me through them every night. Eventually, I decided to get a puppy to keep myself company when my boyfriend at the time was at work or away from the house. It helped to have the company, and I always dreaded having to take her outside when it got dark. For a bit of scene setting, our house sat on the left side of a gravel road. At the back of the house, there was about 10 meters of backyard, and then there was the cow pasture and the cow barn. We didn't own cows, but in the summer, another farmer would rent our pasture space, and so we would have them on the property. It wasn't uncommon at night to hear coyotes surround the farm either. And there were tons. Every so often, when I'd go out with my puppy, we'd hear them all around us, too close for comfort. We had a farm dog too, who would keep the coyotes away for the most part, as she was huge. But every so often, she'd wander around elsewhere on the property to scout, and the coyotes would get a little too close for comfort. They always tried to lure my puppy out to them, but luckily I kept her leashed. Now, one thing you should know about my pup is that it takes her forever to find a spot to go potty. This is still a problem today, 4 years later, but back then it was the bane of my existence. She would pace for at least 5 minutes, and that was only after finding a suitable spot. Sometimes we would be out there for damn near a half hour, just so she would go. On this particular night, it was raining pretty heavily. I was not happy to be out there, and she decided that she wasn't going to go until she found her perfect spot. We had already been out there for 15 minutes, and at this point, she was also getting frustrated with the rain and wanted to go inside. But I wanted her to go before we went in, since we had already been out there for so long. So, as any annoyed puppy mother would do, I started getting a little frustrated and would repeat, "Go! Go potty!" every time she would get distracted from her objective. It was dark. I was cold and annoyed, and to make matters worse, the cows behind us were fussing fairly loudly. This was out of the ordinary for them. They were usually quiet and sleeping at this time of night. I was also hearing what sounded like a strange bird whistling, but I shook it off as probably being an owl. I tried to keep it off my mind as I kept shouting and pleading, "Go!" through the rain. I was facing away from the pasture, and suddenly, in my left ear, I heard it. Now, one thing you should know about me is, I have a very strong flight response typically. but this froze me on the spot, as I was mostly confused as what I had just heard. I tried telling myself I didn't hear it. I tried telling myself that it was just a moo from the cow that I heard wrong. But again, as if spoken directly behind me, I heard it again. It sounded unnatural. It was as if it came from someone who had never spoken a word before. A raspy, deep monotone. Go. It almost sounded like it was coming out of an old radio. But of course, there were no radios out there. Every time it said it, it sounded the exact same as the first time it was said, and whatever it was, had started repeating it as if it had been taught its new favorite word. At this point, I spun around to the pasture to find nothing there. Then again, from behind me, go. This had all happened in the span of about 3 seconds, and at this point, I remember shouting out loud, "All right, you don't have to tell me twice," as I picked up my little fur ball and made a mad dash for my front door. I swiftly locked both doors behind me and sat bewildered in my kitchen. Puppy went back to puppying immediately, obviously unbothered by it all, and happy that Mom wasn't making her stay out in the rain any longer. I picked up my phone and called my aunt, asking her if my uncle had been out in the field with the cows. She said no, and I explained to her what had just happened to me. She sent my uncle over to the pasture to check it out, but soon after told me that he hadn't seen or heard anything. He said he would check the pasture again in the morning. I spent my night hiding from the windows with the lights and TV on loud enough to not hear anything outside. The next morning, when my uncle checked the pasture, he found 2 calves dead. That explains the colossal cow panic that had ensued the night before. I regret this, but I didn't push for more information, as I honestly didn't want to know. But they told me, other than that, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. A few months later, I moved off the farm. I couldn't be in that house alone anymore, and my boyfriend and I had parted ways. A few months after that, I had started to go to therapy for the paranoia that this caused me. I started feeling like people were watching me, out to get me. Another few months after that, I moved out of the province for good, and finally felt safe. It started in either spring or summer season, since I remember the night being cool, with a bit of wind ruffling. Me and my family came back home from either a family gathering or celebration of some kind that took place. After the party, I'd say around 11:40ish, we just arrived home with my mom, parking the family van into the garage. The garage we have is in the backyard behind a fence, since we live in an area where it's closer to the city. After locking the garage door, we made our way towards the back door, carrying a couple of party food and extra items my mom had for gardening. I heard my mom saying something, but couldn't hear what she said. I turned around for 2 seconds to look at my mom, and then turned back towards the door, to only see a distortion of a figure right in front of me. Now, even though it was already dark at the time, the figure was pitch black, making the other darker surroundings seem lighter. I remember standing still for a few seconds before I noticed the placement of the eyes, or lack of, had bright yellow beads, which stared at me and the person behind me. I turned around, and there was my sister, who also stood still, color drained from her face as well. Luckily, my mom and dad were right behind us, quietly yelling our names, which snapped us out of the fear. I looked at my sister, and she looked at me. It was then almost in sync. We both looked at our parents and said, "There's a man standing here," or something along those lines. It was then I specifically remember my mom being both confused and a bit unnerved, and then told us that no one was there. We both turned back, and lo and behold, nothing. It was as if there was nothing there in the first place. Five years ago, I was driving to work bright and early in the morning, and the SUV next to me was in a right turn only lane, and I was in the straight lane while we were waiting for the light to change. I didn't think much of it or look at the SUV or driver until the light changed, and they also tried going straight. At that point, I looked over, as they were basically trying to run me off the road to go straight and veering into me. I was going to honk, but then the middle-aged lady that was driving jerked her head to the side, looked right at me, and her whole face morphed into a terrifying face. I don't even know how to describe it. It elongated and looked awful and terrifying, like that Scream painting by Edvard Munch, but way more terrifying. It's like she decided to show me what she really was and change in a flash. I slammed on my brakes. She, or it, cut in front of me, and I ended up taking the very next right turn just to get away from her, and I parked on the side of the road to catch my breath. I don't do drugs. I sometimes have a couple of beers after work, but nothing crazy. I've never seen anything like this before or after, and I've been too scared to mention it to anyone but my husband for the fear of being called a crazy person. I saw her face change right before my eyes, and am, to this day, absolutely certain of what I saw. The feeling that came over me was just absolute terror, and the look she gave me was certainly menacing. I own a small shed next to my house. I have a TV in the shed, so some nights I go out to the shed and hang out by myself and chill watching some movies. My girlfriend was over at the time, so we decided to go watch a new movie that came out around that time. I have a cool TV setup in there, so it's sometimes better watching it in there than in the house. Anyway, I always leave out the back door when I go to the shed, and most of the time, I usually leave it open until I come back in. I live in a less popular and non-sketchy neighborhood, so there's usually no problems with people being around or trying to break in or anything. At that time, I owned a dog that was in the final stages of being deaf and blind. She was a small Yorkie Shih Tzu mix. She could barely see anything, if at all. I go back into the house after the movie with my girlfriend, and I go to the bathroom, and I notice I don't hear my dog walking around doing her nightly blind walks in the house. Usually, she'll snoop around the house for no reason, but I think it's because she couldn't see much or was getting dementia. So I look absolutely everywhere in the house, and she's nowhere to be seen. My girlfriend and I are both dumbfounded, and we start thinking that she somehow managed to leave through the back door. Take to note, you have to go from the hallway to my room, to a back room, to the back door, to the back porch that's raised about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. So we decide we'll look around outside just in case she somehow managed to get lost and came out on the back porch and fell off. She had to have fell off because it's a pretty big drop, and she was almost completely blind. Well, we look for a bit, and we still find nothing. Absolutely no sign of her anywhere. No blood from a fall. Didn't hear any squeals when we were in the shed prior. Nothing. There's literally no sign that she ever got out, but we searched absolutely everywhere. There's a small patch of woods behind my house, and I thought, if she escaped, surely she couldn't be too far away. I have my phone flashlight on, and my girlfriend is walking with me. All of a sudden, I start hearing a few leaves crunching, and I thought, oh, thank God I found my dog. I put my flashlight over where I heard the leaves crunching, and I see a hooded figure. They're probably about 15 to 20 feet away or more, and they're just slowly walking, pretty much at a complete stop, when I put the flashlight on them. I end up taking the flashlight off them and tell my girlfriend there's someone snooping around out here, and we should probably go back in. Next thing you know, I hear the leaves crunching again, and I turn the flashlight towards where the figure was, and I just can't believe my eyes. All of a sudden, it switches into a tall gray figure running super fast to the left of the woods. This thing is absolutely faster than anything I've ever seen. As soon as I saw it do that, my whole body was just hit with a big wave of cold chills. I can't even explain the feeling. It feels like chills, but from the top of my head down to my toes. I absolutely book it, almost even leaving my girlfriend behind. After we got back into the house, I asked her what she saw, and she said she didn't get to see it. She only heard the leaves crunching, like something was running really fast. I just absolutely couldn't believe my eyes. Until this day, I still don't know what the heck it was. It was literally like someone with a hoodie and their hood over their face, and then it turns into a tall, skinny gray figure, absolutely running faster than anything I've ever seen. I never found my dog, and I never found any proof she even got out. We checked every crevice of the house, and even posted on Facebook her being missing in effort someone would find her. But nobody ever did, and now she's just a memory. But it still makes me think to this day if what I saw is somehow connected with my dog disappearing. I overthink it, thinking, what if it went in the house when the door was open and grabbed her or something?